Good afternoon, everybody. This is Larry Ferris with Latter-day Saints on Zoom. We've kind of called an urgent meeting. I don't want to say emergency, but an urgent meeting to bring folks up to speed on a variety of things that have been happening, transacting in the financial sector over the last week or 10 days that we're aware of, but we're going to discover that this has actually been developing over quite some time. I have with me a client and a dear friend, Pat Stedman. And Pat Stedman, I believe, is uniquely qualified to join me in this conversation because he's so well connected among a variety of parties and a variety of players in this kind of ongoing financial drama. And so, Pat, glad to have you. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Larry, it's a pleasure and a privilege. Thanks for having me on.
I love you, man. You're so awesome. I love your voice. I feel all warm and fuzzy having you on. And thanks for letting us use your system. We're normally on Dr. Doty's system, so this is kind of cool. So the thing obviously we've had this financial issue, the banks, stuff's been going on in the background. And what you and I have talked about, I'd like you to kind of bring us up to speed about is what are the giant picture opposing players that are in this drama that we're experiencing right now?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people view this as some sort of monolithic force, and that that maybe the elites are pretty much all against us, and they're all working together to bring us down. And my understanding of this, my study of this, and kind of what I've gathered from my connections is that this isn't really the case, and that like in really any kind of organization, that there are factions and these factions are trying to take each other down. And right now in the United States, you have the two big factions, which are what I would call the sovereigntist plutocrats, which are people who are likely connected to Trump, and we'll talk about that. Um, Although not necessarily simply serving Trump or anything like that, just mutually aligned interests versus Davos, World Economic Forum, which is the real more insidious force of the two. I don't want to say that one's good and one's bad, but suffice to say that one's looking for a cut of the profit and one wants you to eat bugs. So there's a there's a different scale. Does that kind of give a good update for the beginning, Larry? Or do you want me to go more into detail there?
Yeah, absolutely. Although, to be honest, sovereigntist plutocrats is like a $14 word, and I'm at a $3 pay scale. So maybe you could help me better understand what that means.
Sure. So these are very, very wealthy individuals, businessmen, but I would say mostly bankers that see the writing on the wall and think that the future for America is to reinvest in America, and the future for their profit line is to reinvest in America. So, I don't, again, they're plutocrats, as in these are super powerful, wealthy people who, yeah, they care about making money and they don't want to give up power, but this is one of those situations where their interests converge with an America first kind of um, orientation, because we're going through, and I'll just touch briefly of the two main countervailing influences. First is that we are entering into multipolarity, and that'll continue to evolve through the decade. Um, we have the BRICS countries, which have, since the war, become ever more closely tied together. China and Russia are conducting trade only with their currencies. India is getting in on the action. Saudi Arabia now as well, and Iran. Saudi Arabia will very likely be listing their oil on the Shanghai Stock Exchange soon, which is going to spell the end for the petrodollar, essentially. And so what we're going to see, and it might take some time before it fully unravels, but we're seeing the end of the dollar as the world reserve currency. And you could say that both of these groups see that coming, but they have different intentions. So Davos wants to crash the world economy, and the intention is that they will be able to sort of reemerge from the ashes and restructure society. And I can talk a little bit more about that, but about, what potentially could be their plan. I mean, it's kind of absurd in some ways to think that they'd be able to pull it off, but that's what all signs point to that they're trying to do is essentially bankrupt all these companies, and then the state has to nationalize all of them, and then they own all of them.
Okay,
And
so
then,
you're
yeah,
getting a little bit ahead of me. I'm still working on some definitions. So
sure,
we
sure.
got the sovereign plutocrats, sovereign in the idea that they're,
I'd say
what do we say?
sovereigntist. Yeah.
Sovereigntist. Okay. I gotta fix this. And right now I'm sharing a screen with some notes on it. So sovereigntist, nationalist, America first. Is that correct?
Yeah. What I'd say is like, I don't want to be naive about their intentions. I mean, I do think, for instance, someone like Trump does really love America and want what's best for Americans. I don't know about Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, but I do know that, Davos's plan to create this centralized CBDC was basically designed to get rid of all commercial banks in the country. And JP Morgan doesn't want to lose their their banking. so uh so as you have this sort of, we've been investing overseas for such a long time with this sort of regional, the dollar becoming more of a regional rather than global reserve currency. There's incentive for these, what I'd call these sovereigntist plutocrats, to start to reinvest more in America, because that's where their profits are going to lie, and it's not going to be in supporting this great reset plan.
Okay. And then would you put Davos over, would I also say like woke? Would that
Yeah.
be appropriate or not?
Yeah, all of the woke, all the woke stuff, all the ESG stuff comes from Davos, and Davos effectively has complete control over the Democratic Party in America. So when we talk about Biden, and we talk about how, his policies are so bad, and I mean, he's not really there himself, right? But like mentally, but his policies are so bad, it's almost like it's by design. And yeah, it is by design, because it's being he's being essentially, his team is being run by people who are not operating in America's interests. They are trying to use America for their own ends and ultimately destroy it.
Okay. So what I've got laid out now is the sovereigntist plutocrats versus the Davos WEF, America first, wealthy, powerful, JP Morgan, Trump, that side versus Davos WEF, woke, ESG, Democratic Party America, bad policy by design. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we've laid out kind of the two competing factions. And are these, for now, are these the most dominant competing factions? Are there other competing factions that are also significant players that need to be talked about, or can we focus on these two?
You could talk about a subfaction, which is kind of in between the two, but more on the side of Davos fundamentally. And this would be like the neocons. So Davos, World Economic Forum, are more neoliberals,
Hmm.
and they, they want the new world order to center around Brussels. And that's one of the whole things with the whole Dutch farmer protest, because they want to clear out all the farmland there, because they want to make one huge mega city in the entire Low Countries.
Right.
Um, the Whereas the neocons are increasingly marginalized in the Republican Party, but they still have some level of influence. I think it's fair to say that Wall Street and neocons have influence in the Republican Party, the mainstream kind of rhino Republican Party.
Hmm.
Um, but the neocons want the New World Order to center in Washington. It's more of an Anglo-American versus European faction,
Hmm.
but they're still globalists, right? And I think that the changing of alliances here is that Wall Street was kind of with the neocons for a while, because they were making money on all this stuff and it was good for them, but they've pivoted away now.
Okay.
I don't want to say Wall Street monolithically, but a handful of banks like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and the Federal Reserve have moved away from the globalist sort of mindset, and because it's not profitable for them to continue to do it.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And so would I put Goldman also over on the JPMorgan side?
Yeah.
Okay.
The
And then
negative
Powell probably with the Federal Reserve.
100%, yeah. Powell and Jamie Dimon are sort of the epicenter of it, and then you have, Goldman is a little bit of a lesser player because I think they have a lot of crap in their books, and,
Mhm.
um, then you have on the other side, firmly BlackRock, Wells Fargo, Bank of America.
Okay. Okay. So, rapidly moving up because I know our time is short, and I really appreciate you being with us. And
Yeah, for sure.
great laying out of the two warring factions. And we're literally talking about this is an actual live fire war going on, is it not?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're doing it in economic terms, but this is they're playing for keeps, and the chips have significant, huge implications. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I started talking to you about this because I had some experience with Silicon Valley Bank.
Mhm.
I used to run a private equity firm. We were very focused on renewable energy and developing kind of the approaches to financing of renewable energy, et cetera. And our firm was headquartered out of the San Francisco area. And so I was in and out of San Francisco, and just dealing with this kind of, virtual signaling and woke and ESG and all this kind of stuff, even back in 2008, 2009. And I started to get to know the leadership in the San Francisco Bay Area. So to me, what I saw was, yeah, we've had, Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. And what the media is talking about is, oh, they ran out of money and then they had to sell a bunch of bonds. And when they tried to sell their bonds, the bonds had already lost a bunch of value because interest rates had gone up, and so as they sold their bonds, they lost money, and then they had to change their balance sheet. When they changed their balance sheet, alarm bells went off, and the feds came in and shut them down. But but what they're not talking about is why they ran out of money and the type of governance they had as a bank. And I'll just throw in my feeling is that the reason Silicon Valley Bank was the first to fall, and the reason they fell, is because they didn't run this bank like a bank. They ran it like some sort of a virtual signaling club, and it worked really well for them for a half a decade or more because all these major players in San Francisco wanted to be associated with Silicon Valley Bank because that was part of how you identify yourself as being on the leading edge of the woke ESG movement, was you were part of the Silicon Valley Bank. And yet their actual banking policies were garbage, and so that they didn't have effective cash management rules and constraints and policies, and that's what caused them to trash first. Do you have any comments about that, or am I way
No, no,
off?
I think you're totally on point. You're totally on
Okay.
point. Yeah.
But so I saw it as, gee, these are just a bunch of idiots that, were waving the woke flag and didn't actually run a business. But you see something much more devious here, and I thought that was really worth a call. So tell us about the underpinnings.
Well, yeah, so I think to understand the whole layout here, it's important to understand what the Fed's objective is and what changed. So we go back to the 2008 financial crisis. Um, it's obviously a total mess, and in and there's all these bailouts, and in order to and nothing gets fixed structurally, really. In order to keep the casino running, what you had was all of the central banks in the world began to coordinate policy. So they started to, there'd be kind of this round robin quantitative easing. So they'd all meet up. The European Central Bank would do it, Japan would do it, America would do it, and then just would kind of go on like this. And as they did this, inflation started to creep up more and more and more. And all these central bank chairmen all the Federal Reserve chairmen were on the same team here. They all had the same idea. Bernanke, Yellen, until Powell. Now, it's I think important to consider that because people like to talk about and I don't like the Federal Reserve, but people talk about the Federal Reserve as if it's this um, monolithic thing, and it's always the same. But the reality is that personnel is policy, and Jerome Powell's a very different person from Bernanke and Yellen. And he's called private equity Powell. Like he's a guy who's actually been out there and actually done business. He's not just an academic. And And he has a lot of very close personal connections with people on Wall Street. Trump appointed him. And so Powell was initially starting to move to move this to move this forward, and then COVID hit. And when I say move this forward, so let me take a step back and explain this properly. So everybody blames the Fed for money printing, and that's true, but it's also that the Fed has to monetize Congress's debt. So in the whole COVID situation, they were upset about the printing, but in many ways, the Fed was forced to do that because of all the COVID emergency stuff that Congress put there, and that the Fed had to print money in order to be able to deal with the increasing debt situation. But this was not Powell's inclination, and he was visibly upset about it. And he talked about it. He's like, "This is not something that I would want to do." You know,
Okay, so let's make that point pretty clear. Is it as Congress has continued to spend money and presidents have signed off on it? I mean, it's the entire tricameral government. But what's happening is normally the Federal Reserve, the Treasury would issue bonds or Treasury bills for borrowing,
mhm,
and then foreign governments and local banks and local American insurance companies and such would buy those debt instruments, and that's the way the government would borrow money. But what's been happening for the last, I don't know, decade, you can probably bring me in tighter, is that those bonds aren't getting bought anymore,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And that what's happening is the Federal Reserve has got caught a few years ago. They were forming these offshore kind of clandestine corporations around the world and using the Federal Reserve's money to funnel through these clandestine companies and to buy all this debt. Am I right?
mhm, yeah, yes,
Okay. And so in essence, the United States government was not getting buyers of their debt. It was just being monetized to the Federal Reserve, but they were putting up a dog and pony show to make it look, somewhat cool,
legitimate.
right? Okay.
Yeah,
All right. Please continue.
yeah. So the result of all that stuff was more inflation. Now, what happened um, in where should I go with this? I'm trying to think if I should just give this in a chronological sense. One of the big problems that America's faced is ever since Bretton Woods, U.S. debt has been indexed by LIBOR, which is the London Interbank Overnight Rate. And what that essentially means in layman's terms is that London banks set the price of US dollars globally. And you have all these dollars around the world. Everybody's conducting business with dollars as the world reserve currency. And this is known as the euro dollar system. It's kind of confusing why they call it euro dollars, but that's what it is. It's the euro dollar system. And the Fed, the Fed saw this as a risk to the United States. And so what
Because it was the London bankers that was really driving our policy.
Right, and also, if you were to have some sort of global financial crisis, that would what's been essentially happening for the last decade for sure, has been that the US Federal Reserve has in many ways been propping up the euro through the rate through how the dollars are priced globally. So, and this gets into really complicated stuff, and I'll be honest here, like I do not consider myself an expert in any of it. So
Mhm.
I don't want to get too caught up with the
Yeah, and
technicals.
and one of the things we kind of need to focus on. I know your time's gonna be limited. We got about 10 minutes.
No, no, no.
Is
We got till 5:30. We got more
Oh, we
time.
got a little more. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
so but I mean, what I want to get down to is who are the players? What's the kind of general background? What was the attack, right? And then where do we see ourselves going? That's what I'm hoping to accomplish today. And if we could throw on that.
Yeah. Let me paint the picture a little bit more clearly for people on this whole euro dollar thing, because this is the key to understanding all of it. The Fed wants to pull dollars from overseas back into the United States. And they want to do that because too many dollars overseas means that the US doesn't have monetary sovereignty. So if our rates are being set by LIBOR, we don't have monetary sovereignty. If there's dollars all around the world, we don't have monetary sovereignty. And so while the Fed talks on the surface about needing to raise rates to tame inflation, what it's really doing is it's sucking up capital internationally, sucking up dollars and bringing them back to the United States. And this is especially important in the context of the war in Ukraine, because of that's sort of been the beginning of all this instability. And so you have Russia, um, all the stuff that Europe's been doing with Russia when it comes to gas and oil. They've cut themselves more off from it. Russia's squeezing Europe in that sense, but the Fed's also squeezing Europe financially, because by raising rates, that broke policy with the ECB. And there's various videos you can watch. I mean, Lagarde is pissed off. She's pissed at Powell. Um, there was an exchange where she's talking about how central bankers have the obligation to fight climate change. And Jerome Powell responds and says, I have a dual mandate to combat inflation and unemployment, and I have no obligation or inclination to deal with climate change. Um, so what this is doing is, as there is this sort of global sinking ship, it's Europe that's kind of getting pushed at the very bottom, because Powell has been pulling all these dollars back to the states that are going to be investing in the American market. Um, and connected to this is the moving of the United States from LIBOR to SOFR. And SOFR, essentially, I forget what the acronym stands for, but SOFR is essentially bank rate, the cost of dollars being set by American banks. And it may actually divide further in the future into regionalization, because in the past, the Federal Reserve didn't set a single rate. There were 12 separate regional rates in the country. It may ultimately go back that direction, but at this point, as of January 2022, this was implemented in the States. And since that started, it's been growing, 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 growing. The amount of people who are basically indexing debt to SOFR versus LIBOR. And as of the end of this month, you will no longer be able to buy debt via LIBOR in the United States, and by June, you won't be able to sell it anymore. So, come June, we are witnessing the official end of other countries setting debt in the United States. And this is important because in some sort of economic situation, we could be heavily exposed to a collapse in all of European businesses, European bond market. European sovereign debt market is extremely tenuous. You know, the ECB is constantly trying to control yields between Italian and German debt. Um, when that whole thing explodes, the U.S. is now going to be isolated, or insulated, as rather,
So one of
because
the one of
yeah,
the places that consumers are most familiar with this LIBOR index is it's a common mortgage index.
yeah,
Right, LIBOR is used pretty often to create a variable rate LIBOR. You'll get a LIBOR variable rate, and most borrowers don't understand that what that means is that somebody off in England is determining what your mortgage is going to be 5 years from now.
mhm,
Right, and
yeah.
so by moving away from LIBOR and towards SOFR, what we end up with is a domestic America first kind of a policy around variable rate and what the interest rates are going to be in regards to debt. Am I right so far?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, if you think about it, you can't have a sovereign country if you don't have control over your country's money.
Right, absolutely. Okay. All right. So we've established we got some parties in play: the sovereigntists, the powerful sovereigntists versus the Davos woke group, and we've defined them. We got two different lists. I don't know if you can see those on your screen, and
Yeah.
then I talked about how SVB went down. What was the attack? What is the see if you can narrow in a little bit and see how these specific regional banks that are very woke are being undermined by the sovereigntist plutocrats you're describing, right? The Trump, Goldman, JPMorgan guys. What's the actual attack that was happening to these banks?
Yeah, well, before I go to SVB, I want to make a mention about BlackRock because one of
Oh
the
yeah,
things that got a lot of attention in the alternative space was the fact that BlackRock was buying up all the property in America, and everybody was freaking out about it. That this is going to be the end of sort of independent ownership, and you could see that BlackRock owns everything, and you're basically like a slave, and you're always going to be renting from BlackRock the rest of your life.
right.
Uh,
And by the way, I mean that's something I have some firsthand experience in that in the Phoenix market, BlackRock was so aggressive that they would come in and they were just making offers willy nilly in Phoenix. And so if somebody had a property for sale for 400,000, they would offer 400,000. And then they would come in and they would bring in a group of inspectors. And after the consumers are already, hey, I'm sold, I'm ready, we're heading to escrow, they would then come back during their 14-day period and say, oh, according to us, there's $64,000 in work and repairs need to be done. So we want you to take a haircut. Tell you what, we'll negotiate it and we'll buy it for 350. And so what they were doing is they were using an emotional ploy and a time constraint ploy to really hook American home sellers.
mhm,
And it was just awful because once you've got an offer and acceptance and you think you're heading escrow, people start changing and moving, making other decisions, putting offers on other properties, things like that. And so they had a very devious kind of, in my opinion, a very devious kind of way of approaching the market. Then once they started buying up in a neighborhood, if they got 10 or 12, 15 properties that they owned in a neighborhood, then they would overbuy. And so you could find yourself selling a property to BlackRock at, some significant percentage greater than your offering price. They would just, you're offering 400, they would offer you 450. The
mhm,
reason they did that is because they're buying up their own comps.
yeah,
And then they would use those comps to go back to their asset reporting, to their auditors and such, and say, look, we've got 15 properties in this neighborhood and we bought them all at 350,000, but they're actually worth now 450,000. So we're upside, now we're up $1 million
mhm,
just on these, 15 transactions. And that's how they kept the ball going.
yeah.
Okay.
Now, so you ask yourself, and this is how one of the things that you can logically prove the existence of these factions, because obviously they're not like coming out and saying, I'm your enemy. It's all like you have to read between the lines and you have to look at their statements and who benefits and who doesn't. So BlackRock is acting like home prices are going to keep going up in America. And the reason that they're doing that is because that was the Davos plan, which was to hyperinflate the currency. And so the currency starts to have no value, and then people are either going into real estate, which they are mostly they're owning more and more of, right? And then at a certain point in hyperinflation, you have to sell your home even if its value is going up because you can't afford basic stuff. And so then they would be buying that, and then they'd be able to own most of the new developments, at least the new ones. I mean, they would be basically getting all the houses, and the currency would start to devalue so much the dollar would collapse. They would have an off ramp on the crypto, and everybody would be incentivized essentially to get onto the blockchain, and that's how they would have created their CBDCs. So that
CBDCs,
central
define that.
bank digital currencies.
Right.
And we do need to talk a little bit about that because the Fed, I'll just mention it real in brief. A lot of people get upset because they see like the Fed's got this thing called Fed Now, and that, oh, the Fed's actually getting the CBDCs too. So, it doesn't matter. But actually it does matter. It's very different. The Davos CBDC was literally there's one bank and the bank controls everything. And that it's a central bank digital currency. And, if you say mean things about Klaus Schwab's thong on his beach in southern France, then, you can't have pizza for the next month kind
Okay,
of
so let's be clear about that. So what we can see as the technology already exists is that if you're using a digital currency, especially one issued by a government, that government can monitor your consumption. It can monitor all of your financial transactions, and then based upon your behavior, they can determine whether or not you can spend or not, and what you can spend on. They can constrict everything, right? And that technology exists right now, right?
Yes, it presumably exists in full right now. I mean, they certainly would be close to it if they didn't have it fully in existence.
Yeah, and I mean, I see this as, I'm a tax guy, right? So what I see is all this coding that comes through bank systems, which I use the coding in order to do tax reporting. But I see the coding. And
Mhm.
if I can, and I've created a little software that's really cool, helps me, it's like an artificial intelligence, helps me to do that quickly. But if I can see it, one man tax guy, obviously all they have to do is code it into the system and just say, oh, like recently they were talking about doing a separate retail code for gun and ammo purchases.
Mhm.
Right. And that way they would be able to identify, even at the credit card level currently, they can identify whether people are buying guns and ammo through their
Interesting.
credit card system. Right.
Interesting. Interesting.
So the idea is that now that these central bank issued digital currencies would the technology exists very very easily to monitor all your transactions and then to restrict or allow you not only access to your money but access to how you're going to spend your money. And that's the
Mhm.
new kind of world we haven't seen before is the how, right? It's that the government could be so deeply involved. They might even say, gee, Larry, you're so dang fat, you're not allowed to buy that hamburger,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or hey, Pat, you're so conservative. We really don't think that you should be able to have access to banking anymore, or whatever. You see what I'm saying? They could have enormous control. So,
And they were going to tie it to social credit and carbon credit, right? So based on how much biomass you take up would restrict how much you'd be able to get, and then there'd be further restrictions based on based on your politics. I mean, I've seen some outlines of what is allegedly their plan, and essentially it's a caste system, and you have sovereign class, and if you're a sovereign class, then you have no sort of limits on anything, and you can travel anywhere and do anything. There's only like a
right.
couple million globally, and then there's a series of other serf classes essentially for everybody else.
So,
Um,
so here's a little backstory that you and I've talked about, but I'll just share with the audience. And again, I'm in a different phase of my life. I run a small tax practice, but for about a decade, it was a small but very significant private equity firm because we were pioneering and emerging in a lot of the doctrines that are now applied through tax credits and tax depreciation allowances in the renewable energy space. And so I'm constantly going during that 8 or 10 year period to all these conferences that were of cutting edge. And I remember being in one of the California conferences, and we were supposed to be adopting some planks and some platforms to literally push the needle on the political scale. And I'd ask a few two-pointed questions as a money guy, and it ended up shutting down our session stopped, and they racked the gavel. And now all of a sudden we've got like an hour extra time because I'd asked too many questions. And afterwards, I would say 12, 15 people came up to me and they said, Mr. Ferris, we haven't seen you before, but now remember, I'm wearing Birkenstocks. I got a suit on, but I'm wearing Birkenstocks and I'm from Eugene, Oregon area, and I'm running a renewable energy investment fund. So they're thinking this guy's credentialed woke, right?
Mhm.
But no, I just saw renewable energy as a great way to make returns for our investors. I was quite capitalist, and so they took me in their confidence. And this is a national and international scale conference that I was at, and they said, "You're absolutely right," because I argued, look, all this global warming stuff you guys are after, your expert just said we can't do it. We can't achieve it. Even if we just go after the thermal energy component by using solar thermal, we can't do that. And that's the lowest, cheapest, easiest economic and energy exchange we've got. So what's the plan? And that's when the governor Schwarzenegger, his appointee, racked the gavel, and we were dismissed. So these people that came up to me and they said, you're absolutely right. What we have to do is we have to shrink the human population by at least a third, and hopefully by two-thirds. And it's not some insidious thing, Larry. What we're going to do is we're just going to, and they kind of laid out, they were going to continue population controls. They're going to implement the healthcare system we've got, some vaccine stuff. It was like, yeah, it's going to be fine. If you look at what's happening in China, their population's collapsing already. If you look at what's happening in Europe, population is collapsing already. We just have to push the needle a little bit, and we'll easily collapse the population by one-third, and then we can probably collapse the population by two-thirds. This is the same group, is it
Yeah,
not?
I'm
Right?
sh I'm certain it must be. It
Right.
must.
So these are the people on the right side of the screen you're seeing that are talking about, population contraction in a, and they think it's all cool. And the reason they think it's cool is because they're so concerned about, what they perceive as environmental issues, right? So what I'm trying to portray here to the audience is this these combatants are serious opposition forces that are not necessarily firing guns or throwing bombs, although we see in some places they are. What they're doing is they're implementing havoc. I mean, they're implementing havoc on financial systems. They're making enormous inroads in violating, basic human rights, etc. And I really want to build that understanding for the audience. Is we really are talking about people that are two giant opposition forces, and they're throwing big punches at each other. And that's, as the consumer, what we're seeing is kind of the trickle down. Somebody gets hit in the face and a little bit of their face, a little bit of their skin falls off. That's what we see as the trickling down of the sweat and tears. But there's two giants that are just battling at it that we're not totally aware of.
Yes. And so to tie this together, so BlackRock, they was part of this Davos group, and their plan was for the currency to hyperinflate. And and everything was very predictable. The currency was going to keep, everyone could see inflation. How is it going to stop? They're just going to keep printing more money. People would get desperate, look for any kind of off ramp. They'd have to be selling their homes, etc. So BlackRock was fully on board with that. They were going to make a ton of money because they were getting all this, they're buying up houses left and right.
Right.
And then the Fed starts to raise rates.
Hmm.
And now BlackRock is super underwater right now. They are in serious, serious rough shape. And, you know, as this recession, depression, as these banking crises, I believe are going to lead to a very, very sharp, although I don't believe prolonged depression that will collapse the housing market. And BlackRock's going to get destroyed in the process of that. And JPMorgan will probably buy them up. Um, that's that's just a very clear example that how could, if BlackRock and the Fed are working on the same team, then why on earth would BlackRock buy up all these houses only then to have the Fed raise rates on them and destroy their entire business model? Like, it doesn't make any sense. So these are some of the clues that you look at, and you have to see this. You also have Jamie Dimon, who is, obviously him and the Fed are like in lockstep with each other. He was grilled in front of Congress by Rashida Tlaib, who was, telling him about ESG and how, JP Morgan needs to invest in ESG. And Jamie Dimon was just like, screw you. It's like, ESG is stupid, it's un-American, and that we need to be investing more in oil infrastructure in the country.
Yeah. Okay. So where we're going, depression, collapse of the housing market, JP Morgan buys up BlackRock assets. Um, okay, and that's really the bigger battle that we're seeing right now. Is this is not just about interest and inflation, but it's about these two giant opposing parties in opposition. So what about the regional banks, and what's the attack that we're seeing currently on the regional banks, and how's that coming about?
Well, some of these, you know, this is something yet to play out. A lot of people in the alternative space, again, don't have this filter, and I want to give credit where credit's due. If people in the audience want to really investigate this more on their own, I recommend they follow a guy named Tom Luongo, who that's Luongo. Martin Armstrong is also quite an impressive thinker, kind of in this general area, but Tom Luongo has been really good at piecing a lot of these things together. Most people in the alternative financial space are still looking at the Fed as a monolithic block with everything. So what they expect is that all the regional banks are going to be going down, and they're all going to be purchased by essentially four remaining banks, and then those four remaining banks are going to become like the CBDC. I am not really convinced, based on what I've seen, that that's actually going to happen. And it doesn't seem like it's happened yet. I mean, even First Republic, it looks like they're trying to prop it up. They're not buying it. And the contention would be that Um, some of these banks, JPMorgan and et cetera, are going to swallow up. But when it comes to rebuilding America, they don't have an issue with, community regional banking, that these banks are going to, like no one wants to loan. JP Morgan doesn't want to give a small business loan to some sort of, local mom and pop shop. They don't want to get involved with that stuff. And so there's no reason for them to eat up the rest of the banks. What I'm basically saying here is that it's a very undecided, um, we don't know what's going to happen right now. The hypothesis would hold that most regional banks and community banks are not going to get bought up, and that the only banks that are going down are going to be really heavily tech exposed banks. Although it could create some sort of shudder throughout the entire system, because then you get all the stuff with mortgage-backed securities, which is a whole separate issue. Um, if I just make one, because I know that there's some stuff to unpack there and make sense for the audience, but I just want to say with Silicon Valley Bank, one of the things that's really important to understand why it was a target is not only was it all this, woke stuff that you mentioned, Larry, but it's also heavily invested in crypto, and especially stable coins like USDC. And so if you've noticed before, when the crypto blow up happened last spring, it was centered around stable coins. And and for people who don't understand stable coins, and it is very complicated, to be honest, stable coins are essentially cryptos that are pegged 1 to 1 with the dollar. But they're printing stable coins on their own, but they're pegged to the dollar. You can exchange them for a dollar. This is a real problem for the Fed. If the Fed's trying to drain off, the offshore dollar market, stable coins are a real threat to that, because stable coins are effectively dollars being printed.
Yeah. So, but the stable coins then are the woke Davos group's defense to the Powell Fed Reserve sovereign group's offense.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And
Okay.
they were probably going to be where people were going to have to go to for dollars in the future with the central bank digital currency. But so the Fed is one by one hitting taking out these various banks. So you had the whole thing with Sam Bankman-Fried, which is, what a name, right? Um, he that his whole investment portfolio, I mean, that was money laundering stuff through Ukraine for Davos. It was basically an offshore dollar laundering facility, FTX, that got taken out. Silicon Valley Bank is very, very heavily crypto invested bank. That got taken out. USDC lost its peg for a period of time. Now, if you want to, this is more of a hypothesis. There's a hypothesis that Tether might already be kind of commandeered by the Fed, and because the Fed doesn't have an issue with Bitcoin, which I think for people who are not understanding of crypto, Bitcoin's very different from crypto at large, um, because it sort of has qualities of a hard asset. Um, it's not something that you can just print tons of. So it's plausible that the Fed wants to keep Tether around, so that Bitcoin has something in the crypto space to trade against, but and that Tether will have on its balance sheet treasuries as collateral in order to. But this is more speculative stuff. The Fed's not going to admit that they own Tether, but you can kind of look through the tea leaves a little bit based on how it's been treated in New York courts. It kind of got like a wrist slap, whereas a lot of these stable coins are getting wiped out. So, you know, it's kind of like, who controls, is JP Morgan and the Fed control Tether, and Davos controls USDC. I guess Circle, right? Is I think what it's supposed to be called. You know, I don't want to get too much in the weeds for your audience, but it's suffice to say that Silicon Valley Bank was relevant because it was Davos crypto stablecoin bank. And
And the
expect to see
other
more of this.
and the other banks that we're seeing, what we're likely to be seeing is the banks that are taking the biggest hits presently are going to be those banks that are strongly engaged in the woke ESG kind of side, and that they have probably invested significantly in the stable coin areas and such. And that again is what we're trying to the audience. What we're trying to do is make some sense out of a really complex, multiple moving activities, multiple moving premises. But if we start with the premise that we have is a Davos World Economic Forum group that is in opposition to kind of an America first, and it's all kind of. I'm not saying either one of these are good guys. You aren't either, are you, Pat?
No,
Yeah, it's not generally good. It's just too. I mean,
lesser of two evils.
yeah, I would lean a little bit more onto these guys that I happen to have on the left side of my screen. You know, I probably should have set it up differently, but you know, I would lean over to the guys that are the JPMorgans and the Trumps and that kind of stuff, because I definitely would be in opposition to the woke ESG future that they have in mind. And so, what these two behemoths are battling over are our future. I mean, well, it's our present and our future, and they're jockeying like like 1,000 years ago. These would have been kings that would have organized themselves in Europe and would be bringing themselves into the field for battle to try to take over one kingdom or another, or try to restrict somebody's access to water, or somebody's access to the oceans, or somebody's ability to fish. I mean, that's really what's going on here, isn't it?
Yes, and if you want, I can expand this more geopolitically to help kind of understand how it plays in with broader global factions, or do you want
Can we,
other
yeah,
other things on that?
what I'd like to do is I'd like to focus, because I'm, I don't want to lose people too much. You've done phenomenal, but I'm trying to translate it to the people I'm thinking about listening. So let's focus first on answering the question.
By
Okay,
the way, it's Luong Go, not Luong Pro, just in case
yes,
anyone's trying to.
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So we've started with who are the two prevailing factions. What happened? What's happening is you go broke, you go woke, you go broke, and what also happened was it's a battle between the two factions. And then what we did is we talked about a bunch of background issues. US debt was not bought but monetized by the Fed, what the LIBOR meant, and how the Eurodollar system was really influencing the American dollar system. And
Mhm.
the Fed, who's kind of part of the better team right now, is trying to bring the dollars back into US and US control. And the whole purpose of this raising interest rates is part of the weaponization, right? They're raising interest rates in order to weaponize certain experiences. And here's Powell saying, "Hey, I don't have an obligation to address climate change. My obligation is inflation and unemployment." Now that was not entirely transparent, because what he's really saying is, hey, I'm not just about inflation and unemployment, and I'm not going to go after climate change, but he's also at the same time period raising a sword with his interest rates, right? It's more than
Yes.
inflation and unemployment, right? That was a nod, wink, wink. And then indexing the debt in SOFR versus LIBOR. The whole idea,
There's no you, just for the audience, if that.
SOFUR, thank you.
SOS.
Um, no, that's really helpful. So the whole idea of going SOFR versus LIBOR, good for American sovereignty, bring control of American dollar back to America. BlackRock was effectively a Davos, oriented, not owned, but really leaning towards Davos. And they were literally buying up huge swaths of American real estate. And they're now buried as a result of these policies. They're getting pummeled. The Davos plan was to hyperinflate currency, that crypto is a central bank digital currencies, the CBDCs, we're calling it. And that what we see is that can lead to a social credit system and a carbon credit currency with all kinds of restrictions on consumers. And only the lowly, us, unwashed heathens, JP Morgan says ESG is stupid and they're not interested in not going that way. Silicon Valley Bank was heavily invested in crypto, but a specific type of crypto, which is more like these stable coins. And that's an opposition. That's their defense or offense to what the Fed is doing. But the Fed is taking out the banks that are woke and promoting these stable coins.
Because the
FTX
stable
was,
coins are like offshore dollars.
yeah,
Way to look
okay,
at it.
offshore dollars. Okay. And offshore dollars. You made a reference to FTX. Do you want to fill in any more of the background on FTX here?
Well, FTX was basically this big money laundering machine. I mean, Sam Bankman-Fried was the second biggest donor to Biden. He had a meeting with Biden as recently as September, and essentially, and FTX was number one or number two biggest. I think probably it was number two biggest crypto exchange on its way to number one. One of the things that's been interesting, so, we're sending all Ukraine, it has been ever since 2014. I mean, even earlier, but 2014, especially since we overthrew the government there and turned it into a client state, it's been a massive money laundering and human trafficking front. Um, a lot of Ukrainian girls ended up in Libya, for instance, and the slave markets after the fall of Gaddafi. That's a tangent. But the point is,
Horrible. Yeah.
um, FTX, what was this, essentially money that was going to Ukraine to support Ukraine that the government was sending, was basically then Ukraine had a very deep connection with FTX. They were taking all that money that we sent over. It would go
Hmm.
back into FTX. FTX would turn it into crypto, and then this would all become sort of donations and would go to all sorts of other places. It was a big money laundering machine.
Yeah, and it
Um,
was offshore and difficult to audit, that kind of stuff.
And a lot of those, dollars that went to Ukraine and went through FTX also helped promote this offshore dollar shift system that the Fed was trying to
Right,
move
right.
move against.
And so again, we're looking at two giant. I mean, we've never. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me we've never seen two opposing factions on this planet that are so large and so powerful.
What I would say, I would agree with you in a very literal sense that we never saw it, but I'm sure that there have been factions before. But you're right, maybe, I mean, it's a fair point. At this end stage, I mean, there is a huge amount of power concentrated in both of these groups.
Hmm.
Um, and to kind of give the audience a, as we like to say in my generation, white pill, the sovereigntist plutocrats are very clearly winning because Davos is outmaneuvered on pretty much every front, and they're really just playing for time at this point. Um,
Hmm.
they they're so a few other things to talk about stateside.
Let me say one thing. You know, growing up in the People's Republic of Oregon, what I saw was as the because this type of opposition woke force has been around, gosh, forever. You know, and
Mhm.
what I saw in Oregon is as the left in Oregon got on the ropes, and we thought they would go down, then violence. They took the game out of. It was no longer a political game. It was a game of violence. It was no longer a matter of people were pushing currency around and passing laws, but Republicans and conservatives were being falsely imprisoned, and families are being torn apart. I mean, the woke group was willing to escalate the fight to a degree of violence that the patriotic locals were not prepared. They'd never seen it before to be, over an issue like, grass seed farmers.
Yeah, yeah,
Nobody'd ever seen it become so violent, right? And so whereby we say, oh, Davos and the WEF, they're on the ropes. That's a dangerous time,
extremely
w-
dangerous time.
right? Because they may be losing in the political and the social, well, not so much the social, but the political and the financial front. But when they start going down, what they're willing to do and capable of doing on a human, in a humanity kind of environment is pretty scary, right?
Yes,
Because isn't I mean, I don't want to get isn't this the same ideology that killed 100 million people in the last century?
100%. I mean, they are communists through and through, but, the only kind of s technical pushback maybe is that, like, are they fascist or communists in a certain sense? Because I mean, I think that they certainly have made their bed with as a communist thing. But Klaus Schwab is his father was he ran a factory that a Swiss factory that used concentration camp labor from Germany. I mean, during World War II, that
Yeah. Okay.
they're
So
all connected to
all
it.
right. So on a domestic in the U.S., where we're going, depression.
Yes.
How what are we going to see from that? How quickly? What are the dominoes?
Well, so there was always I think what people have to come to terms with is that there was always going to be an economic collapse because the system was filled with too much junk and um and frankly it's i- it's a matter of they can only been able to control the timing to a certain extent. um the World Economic Forum wanted their own economic collapse, which seems to me to have been, like I said, a hyperinflationary one. But now we're at this point where I think Davos has some moves. I expect the this to be a very sharp and brief depression. And the question is, how is it going to happen? And I do not know the exact details. I know that Davos has, they have financial weapons that they can use. And my guess on timing is that if this is gonna happen, when this is gonna happen, I'm gonna say sometime between May and October. Um, I think that if I could just throw it out there, most likely would be it starts around May, and then it hits its acute phase in October. And the reason for that is the the fact that LIBOR is ending in the United States around that time period. And it seems like this is their last chance of having some leverage that they can play around with stuff. For instance, if you look at this is I don't like, just to give you an idea of how they can mess with markets. They keep playing with the oil's futures market to make oil uninvestable. That's they can't get people to stop using oil, but they're doing everything they possibly can to make it uninvestable by
Okay,
creating massive swings.
so let me read you a quote from Charles Evans. It was a dream that he had. He's an LDS leader of the late 1800s, 1894. And I have it on the screen. The nation had reached an unparalleled prosperity. Wealth abounded, new territory was acquired, commerce extended, finance strengthened, confidence was maintained, and people abroad pointed to her as a model nation. The ideal of the past realized and perfect, the embodiment of liberty sung by poets and sought for by sages. But, continued the messenger who was talking to him, thou beholdest a change. Confidence is lost. Wealth is arrayed against labor, labor against wealth. These are the two challenges, isn't it? It's that labor versus, it's that kind of communist ideology. Labor against wealth, yet the land abounds with plenty for food and raiment, and gold are in abundance. Thou seest also that there has been wrought a great confusion in the finances of the nation, which, together with the policy of many wealthy ones, has produced distress and do presage further sorrow. So, whether he's talking about this time or not, I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty difficult with, one dream over another. He says fractions now spray up as if by magic. Capital had entrenched itself against labor throughout the land. Labor was organized against capital. The voice of the wise sought to tranquilize those two powerful factors in vain. Excited multitudes ran wildly about. Strikes increased. Lawlessness sought the face of regular government. At this juncture, I saw a banner floating in the air wherein was written the words bankruptcy, famine, floods, fire, cyclones, blood, and plagues. So, I think that's a fascinating point. Do you have any comments around that's a dream of a gentleman named Charles D. Evans from 1894? Does anything there you want to comment about?
I mean, it seems very plausible. Where,
Right.
um, what I will say is that you mentioned that it's at this stage that's most dangerous. It's like a cornered animal, and because they know, I mean, they know that when this falls apart for them, that they're going to be executed. I mean, they know it's not gonna be pretty for them. There's no happy ending. Um, so they are doing everything. They will do their best to take the entire world with them, and if that means creating, economic chaos, they'll do it. If it means trying to start World War III, they'll do it. I mean, we've been very fortunate that we have Putin in charge of Russia versus pretty much anybody else that would have plausibly taken power, like Medvedev,
Right.
because Putin is he understands the game, and that's why he has this very slow, subdued, attritional warfare, because he understands that time's against them and not to take the bait to escalate this,
Right.
because what they would love is to take this nuclear. I do have a comment about that if you want to go a little bit different direction, but go
Yeah.
ahead.
Let's just review really quickly, and then we will go international. So, folks, what we're talking about here is where.
Wait. Before you do this, I want to add some more domestic things for you, just real
Okay, go.
quick. Some
Mhm.
more examples. Um, Another example of a Davos plan was Build Back Better, right? And Build Back Better was blocked essentially by Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin, because Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin are owned by JPMorgan. And you saw Sinema
Spell
recently
mention
left the
for me.
Democrat.
MAN.
Chin. So Sinema left the Democratic Party, became an independent, and Manchin is still in the Democratic Party for now, but he only gives them, literally a tenuous majority, and he goes against them all the time. They were the two senators that blocked Build Back Better, which was the big Davos economic, you know, remodeling of the United States.
Yeah.
So that's an example of it. And then you have the situation now with the House of Representatives, which is effectively controlled by this plutocrat sovereigntists. And go ahead. You're going
Go
to
ahead.
say
No,
something. So you can see a lot of these revelations that are coming out. They're going to be doing investigations in the January 6th. They're going to be doing investigations into the vaccine. These are all things that are going to, and I believe as well, the 2020 election will ultimately be on the tail end of all this stuff. But the point is that things are all turning against Davos. There's now investigations into Biden and the China connections. So domestically, there's starting to be more of a, and of course you have Elon Musk and Twitter, who's also connected with all that stuff.
and Elon Musk would be with the
The
JP Morgan
plutocrat,
group.
the plutocrat sovereigntists. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, I
No,
like
not
him.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that side.
Okay. And what are some names on the? We got Biden
Klaus
over here. What are
Schwab,
some?
Bill Gates, Fauci.
Clinton.
Yeah, Clinton, Biden.
All right. And then okay, then I want to tell another story as an intro. Are we kind of wrapping up the US, or you got some more?
Um, there's one other thing I can comment about. I think that could be interesting to put a different dimension on this.
Hmm.
So, and this is the Trump and the military connection. And there's a lot of questions why Trump didn't declare the Insurrection Act. And there was a meeting, I think it was December 18th, 2020, where General Flynn, Sidney Powell met with Trump. They talked for hours, like 5 hours into the night, and were basically encouraging him to sign the Insurrection Act. And he initially was convinced. Later that night, he spoke with a bunch of high-ranking generals and closed the door on that idea. And that's actually was this story was heavily corroborated by the fact that in the January 6th hearings, because it was then acknowledged that Trump had spoken to the generals and declined to use the Insurrection Act. Now, so there's been this question in a lot of the patriot communities why he didn't do that. Why didn't he go forward with it? And the contention is that it would have played in the Davos's hands, and that Davos knew that they weren't going to win the election. But the idea was that if they could create confusion and uncertainty, then they could basically make Trump have to do something like that, and then you would have a civil war in America eventually, and then that would
Hmm.
play in the Davos's hand by destroying America.
Right. And one other point, if I may, and I think you may be getting there, but I'm going to jump ahead. I think one of the reasons that Trump didn't use the Insurrection Act is because, frankly, what was coming to the United States was going to be really, really bad, and it didn't really matter who was in charge. So that they might as well let this horrible time that the economic conditions we're about to go into were only a matter of timing, but not a matter of you could change it. You with me?
100%.
And so
It
then Trump says, "All right, I could be in power, but I ended up presiding over one of the worst collapses of economics in the time of the country, or I can let Davos stay in power, artificially, whatever it may be, and then when the Trump group, whoever that is, comes back into power, they'll be coming after the great collapse." How am I doing?
You're doing great.
Okay, go ahead.
It became, if you can win the election, then obviously that would be good, because then you could have a strong state, and we could weather it, and they had policies in place that would have, I think, helped to transition. Like, for instance, one policy that was discussed that was never implemented, was to start issuing 50-year treasury notes that were 5% redeemable in gold. I mean, that would have solved a lot of the national debt issues. If Trump had been able to have a clean mandate in 2020, there was a path forward that may have even inverted some sort of extreme economic collapse situation. But given the fact that they had gone through this whole thing with the election, and he would have, essentially half the population would have thought that he was in power illegally. He was a dictator. They did predictive
Mhm.
programming for 4 years saying that Trump would never leave office. He was a dictator. He's a fascist. And so everybody was ready for him to do that, including his own side. And so when he didn't, it was like a very much like a Aikido jujitsu kind of move. And honestly, when I looked at them on inauguration day, a lot of them were like almost kind of shocked. They almost seemed uneasy. Like, that wasn't the plan necessarily, to just to take, a castrated presidency, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about, because it was a castrated presidency. Because while the military itself is pretty woke at this point in a lot of the upper brass, and there's lots of problems with infiltration in the military, um, the very, very upper strata, ballistic missile command, is a different story. And I want to mention something that a lot of people didn't understand, myself included at the time. Why did Trump create Space Force? What was the importance of Space Force? And my contention would be that when you create a new branch of the military, you get to select the generals who get to be a part of it. And Space Force also became, it essentially gets control over the all of the all of the ballistic missiles. Ballistic Missile Command was transferred to Space Force. And you also had, what am I trying to say here? Well, you get the you get
Wasn't
the
there
you
wasn't
get
there
the general
cyber wasn't there a cyber
cyber
command issue
command as
there?
well, because it's space, it's
Yeah.
inner space and outer space. So
Yeah, so the whole idea of monitoring the elections, et cetera, that was see, that's how I saw it, was
yes,
that
as well.
Space Force had control over Cyber Command, and so they were monitoring. We kept hearing in Arizona, I'm in Arizona, right? Just horrible experience. We kept hearing in Arizona how somebody had tapped in advance all of the internet connections to all of these computer systems for the election, and then identified exactly what happened. And you're thinking, well, who on earth could have done that? Right? Who had the advanced idea, the technology and the capacity and the expertise to tap all of the internet sufficient to be able to identify all these Chinese hits and all these European hits? And I mean, I'm hearing, I don't remember the numbers exactly, so don't quote me, but like 250,000 attacks on one computer system in Arizona, which had passwords, so they could see it had passwords. They could see that these weren't hostile hackings. They were just unauthorized entries using passwords and already recognized backdoors,
Yes, and it's
right?
and it's possible, assuming that that's just not the bad guys doing their own mischief. It's possible that that is Space Force. And I think there's a lot of people who believe at some point, that it's going to be revealed what the actual results are.
Hmm.
That'll come out at some point. What I want to direct people to, just real quick with this, is on 2 days ago, 3 years ago, right? March 15th, on March 15th, 2020, Trump went to Cheyenne Mountain. And Cheyenne Mountain, for those who don't know, is where Ballistic Missile Command is headquartered, and it's yeah, I mean that's if the U.S. was under attack, that's where all the command and control operations would be, deep inside that mountain. And Trump on March 15th, 2020, said, "I am sealing up this facility indefinitely because we may already be at war and not realize it yet." And set in motion right afterwards for the facility to be transferred to the control of Space Force, and the facility has still not been opened up to this day. So Ballistic Missile Command is still not opened up. Not opened up. Everybody who was in there 3 years ago is apparently, I don't know. I haven't been able to verify on the ground, but this is what I understand, that has not been lifted. And the relevant thing here is that if Space Force did have awareness of the election theft, and essentially what you have is a situation where there is this upper strata of the military that knows Biden is not the legitimate president, and he does not have control of the nuclear weapons. And some reading in the tea leaves with that is in January 2021, Nancy Pelosi freaking out about Congress getting control of nuclear weapons. And she was saying, this is after, this is around like a week, I think, before Biden was supposed to be president. And she was adamant that Congress had to be given control of nuclear weapons. And even the military, like even like Milley was like, no, like that's not going to happen. But why was she so adamant about it if Biden was about to become president? Why was that a big deal? And
Yeah.
then you started to see all these articles come out that were kind of like trolling, like, oh, this, because Trump's not going to be at Biden's inauguration, he's not going to have the nuclear weapons, so they're going to have to figure out a way to get the briefcase back to Biden. And then you have all these videos of Biden carrying his own briefcase, which is like, you are never doing when it comes to
Right.
nuclear codes.
Right.
And then you have all these stories that Biden can't remember the codes, and they're all coming out, and they're trolling with it. And of course, Biden taking his like little, Toys R Us keys and trying to turn on, the nuclear weapons. That doesn't work. It's a handshake agreement. He would contact ballistic, he would input approval to Ballistic Missile Command, and then they would make determination whether or not they would be okay with it. And
And that's always been true. I mean,
yeah,
I was trained in I don't want to take any credit where it isn't due. I never commissioned. I never swore. I went off on a mission instead. But I had pretty significant military training before my mission, and that's kind of how it works. I mean, the idea is that the president has this box, or he has this bag, and it's got some keys and some codes and such, but those keys and codes are not directly connected to launch.
yeah,
Those keys and codes are connected to command control centers where there's another human element involved.
yeah,
And then those command and control centers, it's a fairly quick connection to SAC with like the Minuteman missiles,
yeah,
pretty direct, but it is not direct when it comes to the bombers, and is not direct when it comes to the subs,
yeah,
right? So you've got a long tail to the subs and a long tail to the bombers, and a fairly long tail to the Minutemen as well. It's not as direct, and so people say, well, our response time is 20 minutes. Our first response time is 20 minutes.
yeah,
Right?
yeah,
And that's because of the human. If it was just a matter of the president going, okay, I've got a key, you got a key, turn it and fire, that would be different. But that's not how it works.
yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask you just on a side point. Um, I'm gonna put my own premise out there. We are pushing Putin so hard that I think that the leaders must believe that Putin does not have the ability, the technology, the authority, the something. There's something in the breakdown. You don't push a nuclear power that's capable as hard as we're pushing them.
Well, here's the thing. They want him to respond that way because of who gets controls over the nuclear weapons then. Um, So there's an interesting thing here. If you want to go into like the deeper sort of government spats in control, you have oh god, SAS, SES, Senior Executive Service,
Yeah.
which is kind of like the deep state essentially. Every single time Cheney would go to get another, because he had another heart attack, he was just involved with SES stuff. And these guys have unlimited budget and no oversight, and they're the continuity of government, so to speak. So they want control of all the stuff going on.
And
They want,
those are still Team Davos, right? I'm appropriately identifying this. These people who want control of the nukes are the Davos team.
yes, I would say they're globalists. They could be the neocon like sub faction, but yeah, Davos neocon for sure. They're in the globalist camp, not the American sovereigntist camp.
Okay.
And then you have on the other side the 1954 code, which was produced by Eisenhower, who,
Right.
by the way, was fighting against this deep state. He was the last president who really had any kind of authority to do so. But he created the 1954 code, which essentially is the anti-Manchurian candidate situation, which what we see today with ballistic missile command saying we don't recognize Biden. Biden's a Manchurian candidate, and we're not going to give him launch stuff. If Now, in this part, I admit I don't fully understand, and maybe someone with technical knowledge does. But do you remember when in, I think it was 2017, they had that like Hawaii was about to get nuked, and they had
Yes.
all those warnings. So that was some sort of computer malfunction. But apparently, what was happening is that when there's a signal to the computer that there's going to be a nuclear weapon launch, the computer, to preserve data, begins then sending to ensure continuity of government, begins sending all of the information from that computer location in Hawaii to some sort of centralized computer. And so the way that this works, and the way that I understand it, is that if there is some sort of Cuban Missile Crisis type situation, both sides are sort of jockeying for control over the nuclear weapons, because if there can be some sort of like super high alert, like, oh, there's going to be a missile flying, then SES might be able to wrestle control of the weapons away from ballistic missile command. And I
And so,
admit to be a little
so
hazy on the details of
yeah,
this.
yeah. So one of the things about SES is that the Constitution provides a fairly linear uh, succession of powers, right? But this whole statute and such, it's kind of bypassing elected officials and putting these kind of deep state folks in line for accession into the presidency,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
essentially,
So
essentially.
it feels to me like we've got some really good conversation here, but it's still showing the the conflict between these two great battling forces, right?
Yes.
But the conflict we're seeing right now is banking, finance, coming depression, and these are good background issues. Do you have something more to kind of close this piece?
I just was mentioning, like, I mentioned the that explicit war stuff because these are all things that Davos would like to do at this point to either create distractions or to
Hmm.
create enough chaos as cover. Um, I can say that. I mean, we can go geopolitical now, and what the sort of relevance of Russia and China with all this stuff is.
One of the things, let me tell a little story in the background to open the door to geopolitical. So
Mhm.
in 2018, I got hit with a horrible, horrible joint disease, and I ended up in months at a time in bed. And I mean, it was just horrible, and pain was level 14 kind of thing, you know. And it was a horrible time in my life. And in order to distract myself, what I did is I spent a lot of that time Studying scriptures. I mean, I basically did three things. I studied scriptures, I prayed, and I spent a lot of time in prayer, which was amazingly transformative in my life. And I've shared some testimonies and some witnesses about that. But I also read, secular stuff. And so one of the things I did is I read Hillary Clinton's 30,000 emails. Now, when I say that, I didn't do all 30,000. I did it like a grad
Yeah.
student. I did keywords. I looked at headlines. I looked at, that kind of stuff. But I basically perused 30,000 emails and I read a big chunk of them. And one of the grand stories, and by the way, if you're a graduate student in political science, econ, any of those kind of world concerned issues, I highly recommend reading Hillary's emails. It's like a graduate course in modern intrigue. And what I pulled out of it was this, and I think this would be an introduction to where you're going, and it's worthwhile. That during her tenure, the world had Hillary had recognized that the leadership in Libya, North Africa, Gaddafi had stockpiled an enormous volume of gold. And for a couple of decades, he converted his country's oil wealth into this gold stockpile. You know what I'm talking about?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. And then he hired some Chinese, Korean, whatever, some really smart people who were introducing this new way of managing computers and especially accounting. And he basically went to his peers in the OPEC Arab producing oil states, not broader OPEC, but the Arab producing oil states. And he said, look, we can take over the world. I got this stockpile of gold. I'm a secondary oil producer to the rest of y'all, but I'm going to pledge my gold and I'll pledge my oil reserves. And I want you to pledge your oil reserves, keep your gold. And we're going to back a Bitcoin, which they didn't know what it was back then, but they were going to back a Bitcoin technology global currency that would be Arab oil backed.
Hmm.
And it would have wiped out the American dollar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so what Hillary did is she got with Macron because France, I think it was Macron, maybe not. She got with the French leadership. I think
Sarkozy probably.
Sarkozy, right. He came with Sarkozy. So she went to the French leadership and said, hey, this is your area of operation. And normally the Americans provide air cover and then the secondary state provides ground forces. But in this situation, the Americans provided the ground forces and the French provided the air cover. And which is unusual.
Hmm.
And we and they went about toppling Libya. And so the American national interest that was involved here was it was a threat to our economic sovereignty. But the big question remained: what happened to the gold? Right?
Yeah.
And it's never been accounted for since. And at the same time period, shortly thereafter, we have this horrible incident that happened in Benghazi. And so that to me is a background sense of the degree of which we're talking about these global players are in play. And that she had basically organized a private war that had somewhat support of the American government, but it wasn't official, it wasn't formal. And she got the French to back them up, and American special forces and a bunch of heavily funded radicals on the ground, and they toppled a North African government and then probably ran off with his gold.
Yeah. And
Right.
I'll add some. That's a really good springboard for a couple of reasons. So one of the big tension points in European politics today is between the Italian coalition and France. Italy and France are really butting heads, and Meloni. She actually said this a few years ago, but the video of it resurfaced only recently, and you have to ask, well, where did this video come from? Because nobody had seen it before. Where she starts to talk about the French colonial franc, which, I mean, I wasn't aware it existed. It's like the dirty little secret, but essentially you have, depending on how you want to classify it, I don't know, somewhere between like 13 and 17 African nations. Essentially, they send all they're essentially controlled by the euro because they have to send, if I get this correct, they have to send their gold to France, and then France in return gives them, now it would be euros. It used to be francs, but they essentially don't. I'm butchering this. I'm forgetting some of the mechanisms of it, but the essential thing is that in order to keep a stable currency, Africa has to give up all their resources to France, and then in exchange they get francs or euros today.
Right.
And Maloney was talking about this like this is, colonialism, which of course it is. Uh, but one of the things that this destruction of Libya was so destructive for Italy, because Italy was then swarmed with migrants, because there was no migrant crisis when Gaddafi was in power, because Gaddafi blocked the flow of it. And that was one of the big things that this erupted and then destabilized Italy in particular. So I just
Well,
wanted
and
to say
today,
a
and
little
if I may, for example, today, like one of my big concerns in North Africa is I really love the work of an evangelical minister who died a couple of years ago. His name was Reinhard Bonnke.
Mhm.
And Reinhard Bonnke went to Africa for 50 years, evangelized Africa through really amazing, miraculous ministry, healing the sick, raising the dead, casting out demons, the whole stuff. And he had as many as like 1,000,003 people showing up to his rallies in Nigeria.
Mhm.
Right. And one of his last rallies was a few years ago in Lagos, Nigeria. Had over 1,000,000 people show up that were Christians, but they had historically been uh, um, Islam.
Yeah.
And so, because they converted from Islam to Christianity, there's a group within North Africa called Boko Haram
Yeah.
that goes through villages and just slaughters people, right? And that whole Boko Haram adjutant militant Islam is a force out of Libya, a result of the fall of Libya's previous fairly stable government.
Right. And
Oh,
so
and Libya is now the slave trade capital of the world.
exactly. Exactly. They reopened the slave markets. So I mean, this is just an idea of the evil that is being committed by the United States around the world in our name, and it's really disgusting when you come to think about it. So this Libya was a bridge too far for a lot of these other countries around the world. Um, and so when they tried to do the exact same thing in Syria for Russia, this was a red line, because that would have well, there were two things at play for Russia. The first was that's their Mediterranean naval base at Tartus, and if they had lost that, they would have lost access to the Mediterranean. So it had
Right.
serious geopolitical significance. But arguably even more relevant was the fact that there was a plan to move oil through Syria and export it to Europe from there. And so it was to create a whole new parallel pipeline system to the one that Russia had in Northern Europe. And so a lot of the fighting in Syria was really about who's going to be able to produce this pipeline,
And
essentially.
that's really a lot of the the higher level, there's obviously, local level factions, but the big challenge in the Middle East right now is who's going to control the oil and who's going to control the oil pipeline, because the moment you can get an oil pipeline from, the Middle Eastern oil farms into Europe, that's game set match.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the objective here was to hit Russia from multiple sides. And so you had that, and then you had the Maidan coup in Ukraine, which was a very obvious Western coup.
So
Um,
would you say that the weakening of Russia that we're seeing today is in part an intent to achieve that Middle Eastern flow of oil and to control the Middle Eastern flow of oil through Syria?
well, that was the plan, but Russia resoundingly defeated the United States in Syria. There was
Yes. But
um,
but if but if Russia's weakened because of its embattlement in Ukraine, right?
well, yeah. So tell me what the plan was. So they had this, in 2014, um, and that would have been another strategic defeat for Russia, not only because of the historical and geographic proximity to Russia, but because that would have taken Crimea, which was like their most important seaport of all. And the loss of Crimea would have been absolute. I mean, then they would have lost control of the Black Sea. And so that was unacceptable. The Russians took Crimea. The Crimean population, which is all Russian and pro Russian Tatars, resoundingly, accepted it, was happy with it. 98%, you can quibble, was 93 or 98, whatever. I mean, they wanted to be part of Russia, so they became part of Russia. And then you had these spontaneous uprisings that occurred throughout what, people would call Novorossiya, which is all these southern and eastern parts of Ukraine that were appended to Ukraine by the communists and had a lot of ethnic Russian and Russian speaking populations there. Um, a lot of these were shut down, like the one in Kharkov. In Odessa, they burned 50 so people alive in a building who had been protesting the overthrow of the government at Maidan. In the Donbass, it was the people in the Donbass, which is probably the most Russian of all those regions, resisted. And there's an interesting story. It's kind of, in the weeds, but um, suffice to say, my study of it is that this is a purely organic uprising of Russians, and that they ultimately forced Russia to start providing them with aid. But the first few months, the siege of Slavyansk in the spring of 2014, that was all done by Russian militia. And I mean, when I say Russian militia, I mean Donbass militia. And only after it looked like the Ukrainians finally got organized, and because they were taking some really big L's in the beginning of that conflict, they were going to go sort of steamroller it. Russia then steps in and starts to provide more aid to the militias, and then the conflict kind of gets frozen. Now, here's the thing, though. The plan was, from my understanding, when Hillary Clinton was elected, the plan was to attack, was to finish that war, was to intensify it, and that they were building up the army for it, and that this would have brought, because this would have brought ultimately Russia, and to war, and Russia would have collapsed because in 2014 Russia's economy, I mean, it was just starting to get on its feet, and the sanctions really hurt in 2014, and Russia was not in a place militarily to deal with that, and they were not in a place economically. And the idea here was that they would be able to essentially force Russia to capitulate and break it. And then Donald Trump was elected, and Donald Trump blocked all escalation of that conflict, and it essentially ended when he was elected, because the conflict never stopped. It was continuing from 2014 to 2016. Um,
Okay, so again, this is we got to keep drawing attention. This is Davos versus sovereign, patriot, local control groups now on now on an international scale, right? But still, we're talking about that. So back in 2014, we can see that the Biden family is deeply involved in graft and corruption in Ukraine because of testimony that President Biden gave of how he manipulated the prosecutor over some issues that his son was involved in and
yes.
held back American money as vice president. We can see that was, and that one of the reasons we're actively involved in a war now in Ukraine is because the Biden family is so deeply entrenched in Ukraine as a mechanism of their graft and corruption. But also the reason they're there is because Davos wants to see that area escalate so that they can weaken Russia and continue on.
Yeah, so their objective has always been to destroy Russia, and I think that the sub-faction of neocons in particular, there's something going on there beyond simple pragmatic. These are a very ideological group, and they have blood enmity with Russia. So they really hate Russia more than any other country, and I
So
think
one of the things that's hard for us to understand, and I used to do this. I was a, most people don't know my background, but I was trained at the national level in politics. I was trained at all the way to the White House. I was a presidential elector twice. This is one of the reasons you and I connect so well is we
Mhm,
both have the same passion. So one of the things I discovered early on in being trained in the Republican Party was that the Democrats and extend the Davos group, the World Economic Forum, that's just the international version of the same ilk, is that they have bed partners you would not anticipate,
mhm.
right? That our our more conservative ideology rejects bed partners that are not at least closely identified with us.
Yeah.
right? But the other side will take anybody as long as they will agree on a few ideologies, and then they all step into kind of agreement. Is that you follow me?
100%. And you're actually seeing right now those, like demons start to snap at each other when things start to go poorly. You see this happening right now with the Ukraine war because the more core neoliberal Davos faction is sort of skittish and pulling back. They know that they're not in a good position. The military industrial complex, they're pulling back because they know that they can't manufacture enough to fight the proper war with Russia. It's
Hmm.
the neocons who control like a lot of the CIA and State Department that are
Yeah.
the ones that are really, they don't want to give up. They want to keep going. They don't want to stop under
And
any
and
circumstances.
that's why we put I'm back up at the top, but that's why we put neocons on the scale with the Davos.
Yes.
And it doesn't make sense to most people. Why are the neocons over on that side, right? And it's this unnatural bed partner situation that goes on because what the neocons essentially want is power,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
and that they have found that they're aligned with the Davos WEF because they have a better sense of power, whereby the sovereigntists, frankly, they want power as well, but where they want it is within the wealthy and the elite for economic purposes, and the neocons want power for the sake of power itself.
Yes.
Yeah, and so they've aligned themselves in what you and I, or the average person would think that doesn't make sense, but it's there is some sense to it, and I saw that we saw this early on. The reason they have this rainbow flag and the rainbow coalition and such is not just the social questions, but the whole idea is, hey, everybody's welcome on this side because together to the Davos group, etc., we're all going to make each other more powerful. We're going to accomplish each other goals if we just submit to each other's, common elements,
And,
right? And
and
that's
this
why the
is
neocons exist on that side.
and this is where Epstein comes in because Epstein would seal those relationships with blackmail.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, and let's put this up here, Epstein. Okay. So, and now we go back, if we can. Let's go back to the banking issue again because that's what started this conversation, and with Epstein. Okay. So, what a lot of people aren't familiar with, and I think it's kind of shocking for this call, but the amount of human trafficking that goes around on the globe and the amount of human trafficking that goes on in the United States is really obscene. Can you just give us a shade of that?
Well, I mean, I don't know the exact figures, but it's 100,000 at least in the United States every year, something like that. Isn't there? I mean, I I don't know all the details of this kind of stuff. I know that Ukraine has in particular been a source for a lot of the white children, um, but of course, Haiti was a source for a lot of black children, and then you get into all the really disgusting stuff with like adrenochrome and child ritual sacrifice, satanic ritual sacrifice, etc.
Right, right.
Um,
So one that's something people don't really understand, and I dealt with it clear back in the '80s with the Republican Party, and the rumors were that the way that they were holding power together is that they would use young child ritual abuse of young children in sexual and horrible ways, and they would put people on film and or tape or whatever, whatever you call like now electronics, but they would record these horrible heinous acts, and then the recording of those horrible heinous acts became a control mechanism. So the act itself was kind of initiation right into the group, and then the control mechanism was whoever held those videos. How am I doing?
100%. Yeah, and
Okay.
Epstein's job was to essentially get these people together, and I think sometimes it was a way of controlling people without their consent. They have a vice, you give them what they want, everything's filmed. Now you got this guy under control. He
Yeah.
was like a triple agent. I think he was like
Right.
CIA, MI6, Mossad.
Yeah.
Um,
And so this child trafficking issue, this is one of the reasons that we see borders being opened. The Mexico border is a major issue, and the child trafficking, the banking fraud, the mortgage fraud seems to be a financial issue that's contributing to this. And so as we look at these giant organizations of power, they both have to have their own mechanisms of financial support. They have to have their own. I mean, we're talking about figure out what the warfare looks like, and every government has to have its own resources, its own supplies, its own, right? And this child trafficking thing plays significantly into the control and the revenue base for the Davos side. Yes?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And
And
that
then
was one of the big issues with Trump making the wall, because that was blocking child trafficking into the United States.
yeah, and the wall blocked. Okay. So how does that connect then back to SVB and the collapse of these banks?
Well, a lot of the laundering that was going on through the offshore dollar markets and crypto was connected to child trafficking. So, and that's the main thing that I can say about it. I don't. I know that crypto has been a really useful place for black money, black market money and everything to go around, because people's names can be kept hidden. You just have an account number.
Right.
So yeah, so that's the main thing I can say on that.
Okay.
Um, I'm stretching this as long as I can go, but
Yeah.
maybe I can get up to 20 more minutes. So, I just to continue with the geopolitics thing. So Trump and Putin were developed a good relationship because they both realized that they had mutual enemies. And what Trump did was he bought Russia 4 years. 4 years where they were able to better prepare their military, but most importantly, they were better able to prepare economically. And this was the big card that they weren't expecting, because they were certain, because they've been able to sanction every single time that they do some sort of economic move against another country, that that country would buckle under it. And they thought this time, because they baited Russia into attacking Ukraine. I mean, the
Yeah.
week prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you had the Munich Security Conference where Zelensky said that he wanted to get nuclear weapons, and nobody contradicted him. Um, and and it was just on and on thing. And then they started shelling the Donbass. It was basically they started the war again. I mean, and I think it's OSHA was monitoring the situation, and normally there'd be maybe like 10 artillery rounds fired in a given week across the entire front, and now it was 1,000 in that week, and it was going up every single day. So I mean, people say Russia attacked Ukraine. Well, Ukraine attacked Donbass, and Russia did a preemptive strike against Ukraine. And so, but
So
Russia, and
let's.
then
I want to flesh out a little bit because a lot of people make an argument about that, but I absolutely agree. So what happened was is that Zelensky started dropping shells, artillery shells. Right. This isn't police action. He started bombing with artillery shells Russian ethnics in his own country.
yes, I
Right. And
mean,
he did so with overt permission from NATO and the United States government.
over between the start of the second Donbass war, as it's called over there,
Hmm.
2022, and the first Donbass war, 2014, Ukraine killed 15,000 civilians. Um, no one ever talks about that, but that's what happened. And even today, whenever Ukraine gets attacked in around the Donetsk city area, Ukraine responds by shelling the civilians in the city, rather than, it's kind of like their way of putting pressure on them, I guess, because I don't know
Hmm.
what the anyway. The point is, but Ukraine between 2014, Ukraine's army in 2014 was not really that strong. It was fairly dilapidated, and um, Russia could have taken it out militarily then. And there are some Russians who argue that they should have, but the problem is that if the sanctions had then escalated, Russia would have been broken up, because Russia was not economically prepared for the war, and Putin recognized that, so he tried to freeze the conflict and buy for time, essentially, which Trump gave him. When they tried to do sanctions, in the meantime, NATO built up Ukraine's army to about 600,000 strong. Ukraine's army was so big, it was the biggest army in Europe. It could have literally invaded NATO and taken over all of NATO. Um, so what they were expecting was not really to have to fight Russia that much. I mean, they have this big military in Ukraine, but they thought Russia's just going to break apart economically because of the sanctions, and that didn't happen this time because Russia was prepared. They had they had only like a 10% debt to GDP ratio. They had their economy was resilient at that point, and they had other partners they had developed in the meantime. And so they took these sanctions, and really, I think even the Russians were surprised at how well they took the sanctions. It was a
Yeah,
very
they've actually had growth in GDP over the last year.
they did, yeah. In the end,
Yeah.
I mean, it was really not that big of a deal at all. And all that's happened is that, and this I think was the when this occurred, this is when I could see Davos lost, because now they were in some sort of spiral because they were depending on Russia to get broken. And when Russia didn't get broken, now they were caught in this quagmire. They were investing more and more, and they were losing more and more face, and they were damaging themselves more and more economically. And now what you're seeing is the rest of the world start to pull away from the West. I
Okay.
mean, yeah.
So we're going to see, as I understand it, we're going to see NATO, the United States, and the broader aligned groups to them are out of significant weapons.
Yeah, they're just not able to manufacture them. I mean, and here's the thing: people get caught up. It's like, oh, NATO would steamroll Russia. It's got so much better weaponry, and I think that you can debate this. I think it's a reasonable debate. I mean, nobody beats the Russians when it comes to air defense systems, but
Yeah,
you
their
can
SA-400s
are insane,
scary.
and the
Yeah,
Patriots are junk. I mean,
right,
so
right.
um, but you can argue that American stuff is better, but the two problems with American stuff is that first off, it's designed to be used in an integrated way. So we're giving M77 howitzer, or we're giving HIMARS. Well, HIMARS are supposed to be used in integration with Abrams tanks, supposed to be used in integration with F-22 Raptors and
Right,
F-35. You
right.
can't take one
Yeah,
of
they're
these
pretty
things
right.
and
They're pretty impotent without being integrated with multiple systems that Ukraine is not integrating.
exactly. The second issue is that they have poor reliability. So they're not designed to fire tons and tons of rounds over and over again. They're not prepared for industrial warfare. They're supposed to be
Hmm.
super precise and super
Hmm.
sophisticated. And then the third issue is that the industrial base of the Western countries is very poor, and we just simply cannot manufacture rounds for any of these systems in any reasonable amount of time. Whereas you can say with Russia's stuff, you can say, well, maybe it's lower quality, but well, they can produce 1,000 tanks a year. Like they kept Uralsgrad tank plant, and they kept it open since the Soviet Union at a loss, and they produce maybe like 50 tanks a year. But the thing is, you can scale that factory up to 1,000 a year, no problem. And so 1,000, T90 tanks that have no issue with manufacturing ammunition, even without the Chinese or the helping them, is I mean, Russia's just prepared to they are way more prepared industrially, and especially when you include their allies, because China has a bigger industrial base than the United States and Europe combined at this point, and Russia has a bigger industrial base than Germany. So you know, it's just there's no capacity for winning the war, and even if you did want to go to do it, there's no capacity among the public of the West to actually get involved with it, in part because of all the propaganda. They can't even recruit for the military because nobody wants to be in a woke military. So NATO is screwed. They've already lost the whole situation, and that's essentially where we're at right now. Now, I want to there is something I want to mention though, because this is like I've been giving you guys a lot of synthesized information from different sources. But this is my own inference, my own take, because one of the things I've been trying to reconcile is China. And China's not a good country. We know that with the CCP is not a good, they're anti-American for sure. Um, and we know how much they're involved with Biden. We know how much they're involved with Davos. And so I was trying to like square the circle here, and I think I got it, because now you see Russia and China getting closer together. Russia and Trump, Putin and Trump had pulled Putin away from China. and was creating more of a classic balance of power situation. It was very brilliant geopolitics. China has been very involved with Davos, and Davos was going to basically use China for the Great Reset and, model it a lot on China's system. But I think China double crossed Davos, ended up kind of controlling the people who, thought that they were controlling China, and has now been maneuvering the whole situation to their advantage. So China's shipping fentanyl into the United States. They stole the election. They're trying to destabilize and destroy America. But what they're also doing is by inadvertently having Russia get attacked, what they're doing is they're forcing Russia into China's arms. They're forcing Russia to be sort of more of a junior partner to China and to get more integrated in this system that China is, for all intents and purposes, the nexus of. And so I think this is the sort of manipulation game that they played, that the US is getting blamed for everything that's going on. China gets to be the good guy, sweep in, negotiate peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran because the US is so incompetent. Meanwhile, they're running the Biden administration that is incompetent.
So let me jump in for 2 points here. China shipping fentanyl into the U.S. I live 18 miles from the Mexico border, 18 miles from the California border, and a lot of my friends are involved in border related issues. The volume of fentanyl that is being shipped in the United States every month will kill every human being in the United States.
Yeah.
This isn't like drug trafficking. And I don't know where it's going, but they're positioning so much fentanyl in the U.S. that any 1 month shipping of fentanyl that's coming, so the Chinese are basically dumping fentanyl into the ports along the southern portion of Mexico, and then it's coming up through a couple of drug gangs. 3 out of the 5, I think, won't use it. Won't They're not part of the game. But these two drug gangs are pushing so much fentanyl of the Chinese sources in the U.S. that the volume every month will kill every. It's enough to kill everybody.
Yep.
I mean,
And
and it's been going on for quite some time.
you can see that China's so the president of Mexico was close with Trump. They were working together throughout all
Right.
this stuff. And now what China's done is destabilizing Mexico as well through all the cartel warfare by
Hmm.
backing, a particular faction of the Sinaloa cartel.
Hmm.
So what I see here is that everybody's looking at the US and blaming the US, but it's China that's actually behind. China and European-based globalists for the most part. China and globalists are behind all of this stuff. And ultimately, their plan would be to have the US go fight a war against China in Taiwan and then lose dramatically when China's ready to fight it. And then China becomes, the unquestioned sort of leader of the world and gets everything that they want, including the humiliation of the United States. So that's what I think, and I think that the sovereigntists. This is why a lot of people in the alternative space get stuff right. That China is doing, the US is the one that's creating all this chaos in the world, and that China, is being constructive. But I think this is like talking out of both sides of their mouth. I
Hmm.
I do see a constructive desire on the part of Russia, but Russia doesn't have any other option at this point but to be connected with China because their survival depends on it.
So,
China
yeah,
wants all of Russia's oil. So it's another
yeah.
way to sort of do these sanctions that destroy, Russia. So Russia's no longer economically tied to Europe. That was one of the big things about destroying those pipelines. Putin wanted those pipelines because that was leverage and economic leverage over Europe.
The
Now Russia,
German pipeline you're talking about?
yeah, Nord Stream. Now
Nord Stream.
Russia's economically isolated unless they work with China in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And, so it's Russia's going to be okay. And I think China was sort of maybe playing both sides on it. Let's see how is Russia going to withstand this attack. But anyway, that's
Okay. So I know we're just about out of time, and I want to wrap up a couple of loose ends.
yeah.
And I may be introducing something new into it, but 6 3/4 years ago, a solar eclipse happened, which crossed the United States from top to bottom.
Hmm.
Right? I think it was left to right. In April coming up, a
2024, right?
in 24, in just a few months, another solar eclipse crosses the opposite direction and crosses across the
A ye
Mississippi River.
It's a year and 2 months, right? It's in 2024, not 2023?
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
in
yeah,
right, a year and 2 months, right? So I guess it's 6 years ago and coming up in a year. But in April of 24, we're going to see a second eclipse that crosses, and both of these are going to be 7 years apart and happen on significant uh, days of biblical importance on the
yes.
calendar. And then you're talking about, gee, it looks like, May through October intensity. It just seems to me that those two things are closely coordinated for, harbingers of great change. When you have these eclipses, they seem to be harbingers of great change. Any thoughts about that?
I mean, if you weren't a believer, it's impossible to look at the signs and not see that.
Right.
We are living in biblical times.
Yeah.
Um, you know
Yeah, but any sense of, but what I'm hearing from you initially is, May, we're going to start seeing more of the signs of depression, and then maybe a peak in October. But do you see anything in coming into 24 that continues on? Because the sense of, if I stop right now and move away from this call, which has been awesome, Pat, just so awesome, I would leave thinking, oh, well, after October, a few months, we're going to be better and, go back to some sense of normalcy. But yet then I see this great sign in the heavens that happens in April of 24. And I'm just wondering if you have any sense of what that, how that might fit into the rest of this discussion.
well, 2024 is so I mean, I can take things in other sort of esoteric directions. I mean, in literally 5 days, Pluto enters Aquarius, and the
Right?
last time Pluto entered Aquarius was the American Revolution.
Yep.
We This is going to be, and, it's gonna go in Aquarius, it'll briefly leave again, then come back pretty much for good. This is So there's a lot of astrological, um, and even if you wanna go down at numerological sort of signifiers that things are turning now. This is going to be the year of collapse. 2024 will be the year of rebuilding. Um, I don't The thing is, I don't know that it's even necessarily determined how exactly this is gonna look at the other end, but it seems to me that the federal government, I mean, we are gonna see a complete change in the nature of the federal government. I anticipate on the far end of this, 2024 and beyond, um, to see some kind of more like states again, like the United States are versus the United States is, how it used to be prior to the Civil War.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think states are gonna have a lot more power, and I could see some sort of arrangement where essentially every state is like an independent state, but there's like overarching military protection of them. I could see something like that developing. It's really speculative.
Hmm.
It's all that seems to me very clear is that the boomerang is in full force, and as we get into the spring, I think we're gonna be seeing tons and tons of disclosure. I already know through my contacts that there's the first arrest for the vaccine related stuff is gonna happen sometime between April and July. Um, so we're gonna start to see them move in that direction, which is a whole different thing we didn't talk about.
Right, right. And we could come back.
Yeah.
There's something I see in the book of Daniel and Revelation, and Lowell Taylor's been on this on these conference calls before, and so kudos to Lowell. And the idea is that Daniel and John in Revelation seem to talk about a great power, which we conjecture is the United States, striking both Persia and Turkey, called Media and Persia, Iran and Turkey today, at the same time, and knocking off their heads. Do you see factions that are aligned at the U.S. government level today that would have motivation to take out both Turkey and Iran at the same time period, or are those things still brewing in the future?
Um, I would say absolutely, and the thing is, so Turkey, which we didn't talk a lot about, Turkey's been playing both sides here, but as the West has become increasingly dysfunctional, Turkey's been moving more firmly into the Russian-Iran sort of camp. This spring, there's an election. Expect Davos to try to throw the election against Erdogan and pull Turkey back into orbit. Because one of the things that Turkey's doing that I don't think is really appreciated, that's been a huge blocking move for Russia, is that Turkey is not allowing NATO warships into the Black Sea.
Right.
And, um, you know,
Although they just
putting them
did.
on what's that?
Although they just did. There is a U.S. warship in the Black Sea. Just transitioned last week.
Okay.
But I think that's because of pressure, and you're exactly right that they said, okay, one, right?
Yeah,
Now
maybe one,
the
but
other thing that
no fleets or anything like that.
no,
Yeah.
no, no, no. And the other thing to think about is in Daniel, I think it's around chapter 8, is we get this idea that I think Erdogan is identified by Daniel. One of the things that most people don't know is that Erdogan, the president of Turkey, leader of Turkey, whatever his title is also the appointed leader of all Islam.
Yeah.
That the all of the worldwide union of clerics came together a few years ago and said, Khomeini, who's the leader of the clerics in Iran, is old and sick, and we need to replace him. And they've now appointed Erdogan. Now they're kind of sharing that position because Khomeini is still alive, but Erdogan is the current and heir apparent. It's kind of a shared scenario, and that sounds to me like Daniel chapter 8,
Yeah.
where we have this little horn, big horn, and then the ram comes and just smacks them. And so I would doubt, because of biblical issues, that Erdogan gets unseated by Davos, but that there will be some conflict there. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, and I agree that Erdogan is not going to get unseated. I don't think that's going to happen. He does
Hmm.
have issues domestically.
Hmm.
I
Oh
mean,
yeah,
inflation's off the charts there,
yeah,
but I think ultimately, you know, Erdogan's going to fortify his own election.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, he
he-
doesn't have to win a democratic election. It's not
yeah.
it's not his game to do that anyway. Okay, brother, you've been awesome. Let me just take a moment to kind of make some sense for folks. So those who are listening, right? Let's first just say this is Pat and Larry, right? We don't work for the State Department. We don't have national security clearances currently. We're not people that you necessarily have to pay any attention to, and that's perfectly fine. We're a couple of guys with some experience, decent connections, and decent brains. We're making our observations for you, and we invite you to pray about it, consider it. None of these things are true. None of these things are criminal allegations. None of these things. This is just discussion points. Call it entertainment, call it educational, but nothing too serious, to be honest. A couple of guys having a conversation, and we're glad you joined us. What the conversation is about is our feelings and beliefs that aren't necessarily truths, but our feelings and beliefs that there are two significant factions that mutually align themselves on a domestic basis in the United States and also extend into a global basis. They tend to be globalists versus nationalists. They tend to be more progressive, woke ESG versus more conservative. They tend to be more oriented towards communism versus oriented towards Republican, democratic kind of institutions. And that some of the people in the woke side don't necessarily make sense why they be there, but they're there because there's an opportunity for them to be playing with power. Okay, what happened with the banks? It's a very complex scenario. It's not just what you're hearing, but one of the elements is you go woke, you go broke. And what's happened is those banks have taken on woke policies, and they went broke as a response to those. But they've also been attacked. And the background scenario is that the more nationalistic, wealthy plutocrats have been in an opposition state against the Davos World Economic Forum and liberal woke lefties, and it's been an ongoing fight for probably decades or more. How long would you say?
Well, I would say it depends on which ones. I mean, there's you can say some aspects of the military, going back since Kennedy. You can say certainly since 2001, since 2001. I mean, Trump was invited to run for
Right,
office. He
right,
had 300 generals and admirals behind him. He always would like to say.
yeah,
I think after the financial crisis, that a lot of the banks started to see the writing on the wall
yeah.
in terms of what was happening, but they didn't know exactly what to do, what the
and
opportunity would
and
be.
so in the current organization, at least a couple decades, and frankly, this is an eternal struggle. This is the
Yeah.
same struggle that's existed since Adam and Eve. And so we're talking about, we talked about the U.S. debt. Now I'm not going to review too much here, other than other than what we're talking about is two giant factions, and they're at war. In the US, the war has been, it's been economic, it's been political, it's been policy, it's been positioning people, et cetera, et cetera. But it looks like that one of the sides is about to lose significantly, which would be the Davos side. And when Davos loses, what happens is that's a dangerous time, because when they lose power, they lose the ability to defend themselves. And what they've been involved in is beyond conscionable. Their actions involving the children and trafficking and slavery. I mean, it's horrible what will come out. One of the things we didn't talk about is Hunter Biden's laptop, right?
Mhm.
So, and this is one of my background issues. If you think about Hunter Biden's laptop, we've already been told that there was pornography on the laptop. We've also been told there's child pornography on the laptop. But that, what that often allures to us, and I know this is a new discussion, but I think it's helpful, what it often signals to us is that Hunter Biden was using child pornography. Maybe, but I think more so what Hunter Biden has was a whole lot of the film of significant global leaders and
Yeah,
national leaders that were
yeah,
engaged in child pornography, that this wasn't just him in a salacious act on his own, that his stockpile of child pornography is his crypto keys to control people, right?
yes.
That's what that laptop, that's what I think it was about. Okay, so where are we heading? I think you and I both agree we're into a depression. I think it could last longer. You're saying short, but we're moving quickly, and it was just a matter of time. It's not a matter of it could be avoided. There's too much junk, too much is broken. It's all a matter of timing. It's now just a matter of who's positioning the winners and the losers,
And
right?
the plutocrats are going to blame this crash on Biden, and
Yeah,
it's going to. And the one thing I didn't say, but I don't think that we should be blind to the possibility that Biden doesn't finish his term
right.
based on how things are going.
Yeah,
Who knows how it's all going to play out, but momentum is building, and I could very much see that occurring.
yeah. Okay. And 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 so we see that. I think of you mentioned some of the celestial signs that are certainly scriptural. I think a major scriptural sign coming up is the crossing of the
Mhm.
solar eclipse in 24. So to me, I would argue we're probably looking at these change seasons lasting a little longer than quote short, but we're certainly in agreement. Depression and significant financial issues to come together. You mentioned Cinema and Mansion. That was kind of cool to hear on the Davos team. I hadn't considered that.
No, no, I mean
Um,
against the Davos team,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Again, sorry, didn't get it. Um, and militaries. I think we've done a great job. So, any parting shots there,
Yeah,
Patrick?
just the last thing, what people can expect currency-wise, I think that the ultimate plan for the plutocrat class for America is to turn the dollar into more of a regional reserve currency, and it's going to be backed, like all the global currencies, by gold and commodities. And I don't think that people should be afraid of the fact that there is gonna be a crypto element. Crypto is like AI, it can be used for good or it can be used for evil, and crypto is going to be a part of future financial stuff. But the question is it based on real stuff? I believe that it is going to be based on that, and we're going to be seeing a dollar that's backed by real things like
Okay,
gold and
so
oil.
so as you say, it's not, you're talking about a potential benign crypto, but how do we recognize? I mean, okay, so I told the story about Hillary and how she took over Libya and probably ended up with the gold, right?
Yeah.
But with that, Libya had Gaddafi, the Libyan leadership, had planted into the hearts and minds of the oil elite of the Middle East the idea that they could run a crypto system that would be backed by their oil and gold assets, right?
I think a lot of that plan is being brought
and,
into
and it's being
fruition
brought into
now.
play.
Yeah.
So that seems to me to be the egg, the birthplace of the mark of the beast. A global system you cannot buy or sell without it, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we differentiate between benign cryptocurrency and something that is truly evil and the God will curse us if we participate in it?
Wisdom.
I love that. Wisdom, right? So let's put that to the final point. That's a terrific statement, wisdom. So folks, uh, we've thrown out some opinions, some thoughts, some ideas. Pat and I are both in the same position that we're going to see significant financial downturns over the next several months, right? And that could be shorter, it could be extended. We could have a recovery period. I'm more inclined to think that everything's so broken it's just going to continue kind of sinking. And part of this because I think that America needs to repent. We need to turn to the Lord. We need to, repent, turn to Him, and He'll heal our land. And that's not going to happen. I don't think that we get a healing of the land until we've had enough suffering that we're broad spectrum repenting, right? And but the last thing to be kind of on the horizon for is in the next decade or so, we should be concerned about a currency system that is going to be evil, evil, evil. Maybe Pat and I could come back and talk about that again. All of these things that we've talked about today seem to me to be quite biblical. They seem to be scriptural. They seem to be the way that things would work out if you were right in the middle of the last days. They seem to be the factions that would be at arms and at conflict in the way they would be at conflict in a modern time, and as it described by previous prophets and previous significant people of dreams. So I hope that we haven't been in a place where we've been kind of distracting you from the most important issue. The most important issue of all is not money, global conflict, Davos, currency. It's your relationship with Jesus Christ. That's it. It's your number one. And nothing you're going to do to prepare is going to be more important than your spiritual preparedness. Yes, have some food, have some water, have an old pickup truck you can work on. It's not a bad idea if you can get sunlight to have some solar, right? Those are all good things, but they will not be sufficient. And I feel inclined to warn people that start with being born again. Get your relationship with Jesus so significant that you've had your baptism of fire. Peter calls us to our calling election made sure. And then in the book of Revelation, we see that, and in Doctrine and Covenants for the LDS audience, in Doctrine and Covenants, we understand that there's a mark from the Father on your foreheads, and that there's great, great scourges and challenges that come in the last days. And if you don't have that mark, then it's a real tough time. So, what goals should we be setting? Well, this I hope is just a discussion that alerts you that there is a giant conflict. It's real, it's significant. What do you do about it? Seek the Lord, seek His face, seek His presence, have your baptism of fire, seek your calling election made sure, and then seek for that mark of the Father on your forehead. They're all biblical, they're all scriptural. And Patrick, it has been such a wonderful pleasure to have you today. I've enjoyed our relationship, and it's been expanded huge in the 2 hours you've spent with us. Thanks a lot, man.
Of course, my pleasure, Larry.